Dr. Siegfried Von Kortzfleisch of Stuttgart, who, as I announced yesterday, is a research professor and associate director of the Evangelical headquarters for worldview questions. He will speak to us today, this morning, on the title, or the subject entitled, The Impact of Secularism on Faith and Life. And during the fourth hour, he will also be with a class which I have on law and theology, and will be there available for any students to direct questions to him. So we will invite you into that classroom, which I think is J, during the fourth hour, if you are free and have no other class commitments. And Dr. Von Kortzfleisch, welcome. I wait to hear you.
I'm going to speak about the impact of secularism on faith and religion. I hope my continental accent won't be a hindrance for understanding. Anyway, I could understand I could feel with you if you have troubles with my kind of pronunciation. Today, a number of theologians are striving to grasp the spirit of secularism. They set out to learn what the world in which the church wants to spread the gospel is really like, what people are really thinking. I'm thinking of men like Bishop Robinson or Dr. Harvey Cox. A missionary urge caused them to write their bestsellers. They did not shun unorthodox conclusions, and they expressed their convictions in plain language, thus enabling the general public to discuss their theses. Thus, the honest-to-God debate was followed by the God is dead debate. There's no doubt, as we perhaps agree, that the protagonists of modern theology do base their theories on a significant experience and are pursuing a serious mission. Indeed, it has become difficult to speak of God in metaphysical or quasi-metaphysical terms. For the average human being today, this God scarcely possesses a comprehensible reality and is therefore scarcely relevant in his life. And the function of the church in the life of the individual and society is by and large steadily decreasing, while at the same time its social prestige might occasionally even be growing. There is no longer any disagreement about this among religious sociologists. We have grown accustomed to calling those positions secularization or secularism. For a long time, secularism was lamented as a disaster. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of the first to put it onto a separate footing by coining the positive phrase, "The world has come of age." And there are others who describe secularization as a legitimate outcome of Christian history. I'm also of the opinion that we should not treat the secularized world as if it were basically evil and anti-Christian. I'm sympathetic toward those who, like Harvey Cox, even speak up in favor of secularized profanity. I would like to be such a protagonist myself. However, I'm afraid that in our attempt to take this world which has come of age seriously, we will in turn become blind. that we will not look closely enough to find out whether the secularized world is really as secularized as prophets of modern theology maintain. I do not mean those theologians who maintain that we are living at a time where God is dead. This phrase is a hypothesis of historical philosophy and as such neither theologically nor empirically verifiable. Rather, I'm thinking of all those who hold that the secularized world is an a-religious world. We must ask, is a secular man necessarily also a-religious? Is it not possible that the forms of religious expression and the structures of religiosity are merely changing? There are reasons why the theologians of secularism are not posing these questions. The primary reason lies in their one-sided understanding of religion. This understanding is predominantly molded by conceptions of Christian history. According to that understanding, religion requires a highly developed and differentiated institutional form, that means church and cult. It further requires an equally differentiated theology, which refers to a transcendent God, or to the absolute, or to the reality of the holy. On the side of the believers, there are the spiritual forces and their religious activation. There is something like a religious a priori whose organ is mainly the feeling of man. The feeling of man. The essential elements of religion would thus be cult and church, metaphysical theology, and religious feeling. The theologians of secularism are perfectly right in saying that this religion is losing its social power, its significance. However, they came to the conclusion that religion as such was about to disappear. Their forefathers' optimism has turned into pessimism. It would, however, be more realistic merely to state the traditional understanding of what religion and religiosity ought to be. And this understanding had largely been determined by the high religions, is losing its validity. It is scientifically unsound to say anything more definite. If we really intend to take the secular world seriously, we must also recognize as a religion the vast amount of religion alive in it. The secular world and religion are not mutually exclusive, but it is true there is no single area of our religious life which has not been affected by the consequences of secularization and which has not undergone a basic change. On the other hand, there are in the secular world quasi-religious phenomena that, as far as we know, have never before existed in history. Gigantic shifts and dislodgings are taking place in the religious structure of modern society. But so far it seems to me that there is no proof that the process of secularization must of necessity produce an absolutely a-religious man. From the point of view of methodology, this means we have to free ourselves still further from the 19th and beginning of 20th century preconceptions of religious philosophy before we are able to arrive at a religious diagnosis of the present. And we must proceed more cautiously in giving forecasts about the future of religion. Consequently, instead of speculating about the future, we shall turn to the present. A new design of the morphology of religion is needed. Essentially, there are four groups of religious phenomena. First, the high religions. Second, the ideological large-scale systems like communism, socialism, and so on. Third, a series of religious structures which had been suppressed for a long time in the Christian world, from which the secular world originated, but which were never altogether eliminated, like superstition and magic, gnosis, astrology, and natural religions, and so on. Fourth, there are newly developing quasi-religious structures. While the fourth group is a product of the secular world, the three other groups are rather victims of secularization. We must at least briefly refer to the changing effects of secularization in detail. Not only the Christian churches and sects, but other high religions as well, exert their influence on the pluralist societies of the Western world. Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. All of them are suffering from the effects of secularism. Among these effects we have the following. First, it has been convincingly proven by sociologists that the great churches are still increasingly losing their social functions. A religiously closed society is no longer conceivable anyway. But even the life of the individual believer is no longer permeated by his faith. Theology has ceased to be the final and supreme spiritual authority and has not yet been generally accepted as an equal partner along with the other disciplines of thought. Second, the secular world requires an adjustment on the part of the religions, which will occasionally touch their historical substance. Christianity, for instance, will be heavily affected if we deduce from the profanity of the modern world that God is dead. In such a paradoxical Christianity without God, church services would have to change drastically if they were maintained at all every Sunday as before. For the Eucharist, prayers, absolution, and so on would lose most of their meaning. Third, there is a change not only in the visible forms of institutionalized religion, but also in the inner form of faith itself. Faith becomes more superficial. There are only few people today who would be prepared to sacrifice their lives for their faith. A firm conviction has degenerated into a mere opinion. Hans Otto Wölber, who is now a Lutheran bishop in Hamburg, in his book Religion Without Decision, uses the term opinion religion. In general, people know very little about their own faith. Otherwise, there would not be so many syncretisms. Fourth, religious thoughts and doctrines separate from the believers and their churches and are consequently diffused. They become independent from a group of believers. Religious ideas are spread by the mass media and thus offered for sale like an ordinary commodity and consumed as such. Naturally, this leads to a secularization of religious ideas. Fifth, judging by their outer appearance, modern radical sects do not correspond to this image. However, Kurt Hutten, an authority on sects, has proved that the sects in their protest against secularism are themselves deeply marked by secularism. They deceive modern man in his anxiety and frustration with the illusion of a possible reappearance of a close, spiritually uniform, religious and social world. But the radicalism of these sects itself proves this to be an utopia. Thus, their protest proves nothing but their helplessness in the confrontation with the overwhelming developments in the secular world. As soon as their members have become happily integrated into the purely worldly affluent society, the radical and totalitarian sects lose their attraction for them. In Germany, for instance, sects enjoyed a veritable boom after the Second World War, but in recent years their growth has almost come to a standstill. Anyway, it seems that the diffusion of religious ideas and the sectification of the churches are complementary tendencies. If I'm right, we have now mentioned the most important consequences of secularism for religion, namely, first, the Church's loss of its integrative and determinant force. Second, the change of religious patterns due to adjustment. Third, the evolution towards opinion religion. Fourth, the dispersion or diffusion of religious ideas. And fifth, the tendency towards sectification. How much of what has been said can also be applied to the large-scale ideological systems? First of all, how far are we justified in speaking of nationalism, communism, evolutionary humanism, or racism in this context? Commonly, these systems are not religious and do not want to be religious. Communism is even decidedly anti-religious, as is the evolutionary humanism of Aldous Huxley, for example. There is, however, much to be said in support of the thesis that the great ideologies can only be correctly understood if interpreted as an outflow of Christian history. They turn out largely to be a mirror image or mirror distortion of Christianity and the Church. They are or were thriving on quasi-religious pathos, on originally Christian hope for a blessed future, on politically transformed ideas of God's kingdom, or on biological concepts of the chosen people. But the development did not continue itself to a simple secularization of religious motives. As soon as the ideologies had penetrated the social reality, they themselves resumed a clearly religious character, even while continuing to fight the historical religions. This is particularly evident in the case of communism. It reflects a great number of Christian elements: pietistic missionary religiosity, hierarchically graded salvation knowledge, and a Roman scholastic authority, orthodox veneration of saints and Jesuit obedience, Calvinistic church discipline, confession, and absolution. It is also generally known that the nationalism of Hitler or Kwame Nkrumah, to cite another example, bore messianist aspects. The ideologies, it is true, are not religious proper, but they are or can be religious, and for many people they fulfill a function otherwise fulfilled by religion. They bind men. They lay down supreme values whose validity remains forever unquestioned. They influence or transform his way of life. Beyond this, they offer meaning and integration to the entire society. As the ideologies fulfill such functions, it is understandable that they take over certain facets of the historical religions, that is, dogma, cult, emotionality, and so on. The more religious elements there are in an ideological system, the easier it becomes for this system to take over the place of the old religion in the life of the individual and of the society. True, only one system, the communism, has succeeded in establishing itself in the long run as an absolute state religion. Compared to it, fascism and Nkrumahism enjoyed only a short rule. But since the times of Stalin, world communism as well has become a standard example for the disintegrating effects of the secular world. Schisms are appearing, denominations are emerging, the ideology is losing its integrative force, the blind obedience of the believers is weakening, the Marxist-Leninist doctrine is losing its authority as a scholastic system, standardizing all life and thought. Communism has entered its age of enlightenment. Other ideologies were unable and perhaps not fit to develop in this manner into a permanent anti-church. They form sects and they are secularized. That is, certain elements of the ideology become a part of everyday life. Fanatical nationalism, for instance, seems to be confined, on the one hand, to crank societies, a number of very small groups in Germany, or let's say the John Birch Society in the States. On the other hand, there is a general inclination towards nationalism, which comes out into the open from time to time, as, for instance, during the World Cup games. We observe the great ideology there. Excuse me, it's a funny word. We observe the great ideologies degenerating into sects or disintegrating. But they leave behind an atomic fallout which continues to influence the men in the streets. And at any moment, these fallout products may resume quasi-religious significance. As a rule, laymen will not recognize this ideological background. Of course, all they can see are mirror images, fragments, dim idols. However, this does not prevent many people from developing emotional ties to these idols and from following them, maybe for the very reason that they are dim. Few people are taught to think critically, and few take trouble to apply more of this knowledge than is absolutely necessary. Consequently, there remains a wide area of blind trust, fertile soil for substitute beliefs of manifold character. The observations we have made so far lead us to qualify Bonhoeffer's statement about the world that has come of age. Bonhoeffer is right if he means to say that secularization is irreversible and enables man to fulfill his task of dominating the world in responsibility before God. Seen this way, secularization is a promise and a challenge to modern men to come of age. Empirically speaking, however, we must admit that the average man today has not yet come of age, and that the pluralism of the religious and ideological supply offered to him makes it easier than ever before for him as a Christian to flee from his coming of age. Besides the religiously tainted ideologies, we have a number of phenomena that had long been suppressed during the history of the Church. For some time, they survived in the catacombs only. Some are handed down only in secret succession as a gnosis. Some have always existed below the level of public consciousness. This is still true today for magic and occult practices. Astrology was the only one which enjoyed public recognition already for a long time. Today, in the pluralistic Western society, all this finds open and almost uninhibited expression. Normally, the religious motives freed by the secular world will spread without something like a church forming around them. The Gnostics still formed a community in 1913, the Anthroposophic Society. Today, the Gnostics will form esoteric lodges or exert their influence on education and literature. Their primary aim is to influence thinking and pass on their ideas. The creation of communities remains secondary. The mobility of society, fully developed only in the past few decades, hampers the formation of compact communities. On the other hand, the efficiency of indirect communication systems has rendered the creation of communities somewhat superfluous. The end of the 19th and beginning of 20th centuries were characterized by the foundation of denominations and sects. Today, a religious impulse will much more frequently institutionalize in a propaganda center. Christianity is certainly no exception. A particularly outstanding example of this might be one of the evangelism associations, as you have one in this city. In Germany, there are more than 400 private enterprises having to do with the gospel. And the antique religious concepts revived today make use of the same type of institutions. They form propaganda centers for spreading their ideas. The religious landscape of the present is rounded off by Thomas Lackman's so-called quasi-religious structures. These are not disintegration products from ideologies or secularization products of ancient religious elements. These emerge, so to speak, from below, having their origin in everyday life. They emanate from the values upheld by modern society: success, efficiency, happiness, and security. Within them, man searches for self-affirmation, self-fulfillment, final meaning. These provoke his most strenuous efforts. Thence the cult of work. They make him strive for success, which is no longer signified by decorations and titles, but rather by the extent of conspicuous prestige consumption. This same desire forces man to do his best in order to become efficient. Sports are one form of this effort. The veneration of knowledge is another. The supreme value, namely happiness, is sought after in the sexual sphere. This justifies our examining sexualism for quasi-religious aspects. The providing of security is today regarded as the main task of the family, and the exclusive family life is appreciated more than ever before. Thus, the critical term familism is justified. All this, of course, does not attempt itself to become a religion. There are at first only secular or worldly values that do have a relative right to existence. However, they sometimes are made absolute values. In that cases, the result is an involvement which is no longer rationally based and which might bind man as strongly or even more strongly than his official religion or alleged non-religiosity. Martin Luther supplied us with a simple but exact definition when he said, "Whereupon you set your heart, and whereupon you rely, that is really God." We should say a substitute God. Quasi-religious structures have no definite institution, no dogma. Therefore, they are difficult to grasp. for they are simply a reality, they are being enacted. Nevertheless, they often tend to enter into relations with traditional religious concepts or assume ritual forms. The decoration of champions during sporting events can be interpreted as a cult. Beauty contests and the crowning of beauty queens are also rites in this sense. In any case, we must keep these phenomena in mind if we now want to summarize. First, the secular world contains a highly differentiated and extensive amount of religious and quasi-religious phenomena. The thesis that the secular world is about to become completely a-religious can at present not be convincingly substantiated. Moreover, there are socio-philosophic theories according to which a society without religious superimposition is inconceivable. See Durkheim or Lackman. Fact is that the outer appearance of religions is undergoing a profound change. This change is accompanied by considerable losses for religions with highly developed institutions. Second, the churches must realize that all people, including the official members of churches, are influenced by numerous religious and quasi-religious thoughts. Those are trying to bind and involve men. They are undermining or paralyzing the church-bound faith. In the long run, the substance of faith can no longer be effectively standardized or controlled. Syncretisms have therefore become the order of the day. And since those other religious elements are ordinarily not recognized or accepted as such, most people do not even realize that they are paradoxical believers. For this reason, the latent conflict between the Christian faith and other religious ties hardly ever comes to the open. Necessary decisions or clarifications are not undertaken. If our diagnosis is correct, it leads to a series of consequences. Let me name a few of them in aphoristic briefness. First, in the future we may no longer expect to live in a closed Christian environment. Competition with other great religions is being carried out in our own countries, not only just abroad or in literature. And competition is no longer between religious communities as such, but between individual Christians and individual non-Christians. Each and every Christian must from now on be basically responsible for his faith. It has become urgently necessary to educate the laymen so that they may come and remain of age. Second, the basic and unlimited religious pluralism in our societies reminds us of the fact that it is useless to denigrate other forms of faith by applying standards of religion and standards of religious, for they are able to bind us and our neighbor. Third, a dialogue must be held between Christianity and other religions. This dialogue will challenge the Christian faith to spell out his substance new and more clearly than before. If a Christian is prepared to have his faith questioned, and only then will he draw from this process convincing missionary force. Fourth, at last, every Christian must be taught to ask himself Is there anything I have set my heart on so that it is dependent on it for good or for bad? On what do I rely in case of emergency? On success? On the ability to survive? The blessings of the economic miracle, or let's say the American way of life? Or on the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? This question is not meant to imply that prosperity, health, success, or the joy of competitive sports are inherently evil. It is rather a matter of maintaining or restoring to these secular values their relative significance. For as total or absolute values, they are bound to lose their secularity and normally their humanity, and this cannot be God's will. Thank you.
I think we might express our appreciation by applause.